We tend to think of World War I and World War II as these two separate, massive events. But what if the First War never really ended? What if the so-called peace that came after it was just a 20-year countdown to something even worse? Well, that's what we're going to dive into. We're going to trace that fragile line from one conflict to the next and see how the end of World War I didn't secure peace, but actually paved the road for the Second World War.
Right. It was famously called the War to End All Wars, a conflict so unbelievably brutal the whole world thought, okay, that's it, never again. And yet, just 2 decades later, the planet was on fire again in an even deadlier war. So you have to ask, what went so completely, fundamentally wrong? How did that promise of a lasting peace just shatter?
And here's the heart of the problem. The peace deal that ended World War I, especially the famous Treaty of Versailles, it didn't actually solve the issues that started the war. No, instead, it just kind of reshaped them, creating a whole new set of problems that were left to bubble away for the next 20 years. The peace itself, you could say, was built on a really cracked foundation.
So let's start by looking at that first major crack in the foundation. And this wasn't just a little hairline fracture either. This was a deep structural flaw of political resentment, and it was baked right into the treaties that were supposed to be healing Europe. I mean, just look at the difference between what they said they wanted and what they actually did. The idealistic goal, the big speech, was all about creating stability and cooperation for a new world. But the reality, especially for Germany, was a peace designed to punish. It was way less about building a better future together and a whole lot more about settling old scores. And wow, when you get into the details, you really see how punitive it was. Germany was forced to sign something called the War Guilt Clause, basically saying, yep, this whole thing was 100% our fault. Then they were hit with absolutely massive payments, reparations, that just crushed their economy. They lost huge chunks of land, and their military was cut down to almost nothing. For millions of Germans, this wasn't a treaty, it was a national humiliation.
And the result? Well, it was pretty predictable. Instead of helping Germany get back on its feet and rejoin the world community, these harsh terms just stirred up this powerful mix of anger, resentment, and a real feeling of injustice. This created the perfect story of victimhood that down the line, nationalist movements would use with absolutely devastating results.
Okay, so you've got this deep political anger simmering. Now, let's add the second massive crack that appeared in the foundation of peace. The entire global economic system literally fell apart. You can just see the dominoes falling here, one after the other. First, the world economy was already shaky, held together by this tangled mess of war debts and those German reparations we just talked about. Then, boom, the shock, the Great Depression hits, and the whole system just shatters. As panic takes over, countries stop working together. Instead, they all throw up economic walls, trying to protect themselves. And what happens then? Well, international peace suddenly becomes a luxury that nobody can afford. When people are just trying to feed their families, big ideas about global cooperation take a backseat to pure national survival. The economic glue that was barely holding the world together just dissolved. So we've got political resentment and economic catastrophe. The third and final crack in the foundation was the failure of the one organization created specifically to stop this from ever happening again, the League of Nations. The League was built on this really powerful idea called collective security. The concept's pretty simple. If one member nation gets attacked, it's considered an attack on everybody, and everyone is supposed to team up to stop the bad guy. On paper, it's a fantastic idea for preventing war. But, and this is a huge but, here's the fatal flaw. The League of Nations was all bark and no bite. It could pass resolutions, it could condemn countries, but it had no army. It had no real power to actually enforce any of its decisions. And some of the biggest players, like the United States, never even joined. Nobody was willing to risk their own soldiers to enforce the rules.
So what lesson do you think aggressive countries learned from this? They learned they could pretty much get away with anything. Nations like Japan, Italy, and of course, Germany started testing the waters, invading their neighbors, ripping up treaties, and nothing really happened. The League's inaction sent a really clear and really dangerous message to the world. The rules don't apply anymore.
All right, so let's put it all together. When you combine these three huge failures, the political anger, the economic collapse, and the powerless institutions, a really grim picture starts to form. You can begin to see how a second, even bigger world war started to feel less like a possibility and more like an inevitability.
Yeah, and this quote really just nails it. This toxic environment of national shame and economic desperation was the perfect breeding ground for extremism. Leaders popped up promising to make their countries proud again, to take back lost lands, and to solve every problem with military force. This table just lays it all out, plain and simple. The political resentment from the peace treaty, that fueled a desire for revenge. The economic collapse, that destroyed cooperation. The institutional weakness of the League, that meant there were no consequences for being a bully on the world stage. And all of that together led to this dangerous shift where countries just gave up on talking and decided war was the answer.
So here's the bottom line. By the late 1930s, that cracked foundation for peace we've been talking about hadn't just settled, it had completely crumbled away. There was nothing left holding up the international order. The world was just sliding unstoppably toward another global catastrophe.
And all of this brings us to a really important question, one that's still relevant today. We've seen how a bad peace deal can be almost as dangerous as the war that came before it. So if a flawed peace is really just a pause between wars, what does it actually take to build one that lasts?